Good to go?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, John. Thanks everybody who's popping in for this little quick presentation about ways to use AI to improve assessments, rubrics, and assignments. My name is Tyler King. I'm a new professor of practice here at SUNY Oswego in multimedia journalism in our unit of broadcasting and digital media in the Comm Studies department. Brand new both to SUNY Oswego and to teaching in general. Had a career in broadcasting and then sports management that parlayed its way into joining this awesome team here in August. So I don't come to this as someone with the decades of experience that a lot of other presenters today have brought to the mix, just as very much a rank amateur who's gotten his way through his first year without complete disaster by using some of these tools in what I think are productive ways. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, when I signed up for the symposium, I noted some of my uses of AI, and that led to John inviting me to share them with the group. So if they are dull and uninteresting, it's at least 50% his fault and not entirely mine. At least that's what I'm going with. There's one main point that I want to get across to people, which is that AI isn't really great at building things for you. We're all short on time, and we get a lot of hype, especially I find from the AI companies themselves, that the AI will do it for you. You can see up in the slide here right above my head, those lovely starry buttons that show up in Brightspace anytime you're trying to do something. Oh, just click here, let Brightspace do it for you. I'll generate the assignment ideas for you. I'll generate your quiz questions. And it can be tempting to think, oh, I can just hit a button and my job is done for me. What I've found is that you get pretty much the exact opposite of that. If you ask it to build something from scratch, you get stuff that's extremely generic. You get stuff that you have to rewrite sometimes several times. And you don't save any time because you have to spend so much time on quality control that you may as well have just done it yourself. So it doesn't become a very productive relationship. This is getting better as the models get better. It's still not perfect. I came from a marketing background when these tools first started coming out in the early 2020s, and we were all getting marketing copy that looks like that black text there on the right side of my slide. Every team in my league where we had limited business staffs because we were a junior hockey organization, people thought, oh, good, AI is here to do all my marketing copy for me. And everyone's copy sounded exactly the same. It was always purchase your tickets because we couldn't use the word buy. It was always hockey is fast paced. It was always talking about the hometown team. And this was the challenge we had to deal with, was how do you look different if the output is going to be the same for everybody? And a better prompt doesn't tend to fix this. But what can fix it is changing the job that you're giving to the AI model in the first place. So what I'm proposing to people is you use AI to scaffold, you don't use it to outsource the actual work. You yourself bring the expertise, whether it's in the professional world or the educational world. That's something that AI can't replicate, at least not quite yet, and God help us all if it ever can. But we can let AI bring the volume, and I mean that in the sense of the sheer amount of work and processing that it can do. So when we generate from scratch with AI, it tends to disappoint us for three main reasons. It doesn't understand your course, it doesn't understand your students, and it defaults to a generic average of the internet type of content. And as a lot of people have talked about over the course of today, it will state incorrect things extremely confidently. So one way around this is to flip the job. You give it your draft of something, and I'm going to show a few examples of this. One level of a rubric, the correct answer in a quiz, and the output that the AI generates is going to inherit at least some of your judgment, as opposed to its averaging of the internet that it takes when it gets a more generic prompt. There are two habits that I had to develop in order to make this actually work and not be incredibly frustrating. The first one was to be specific. You very much have to handhold when it comes to generating a lot of this output, and always review and refine the output. And I'll be showing you a few examples of that moving ahead here. So one of the best things we can do with assignments is not to ask it to write them for us, but rather to use it to stress test existing assignments, maybe assignments that are in need of a refresh that we've been doing for the past 10, 20 years and we want to modernize to an extent. I find that to be much more productive than asking an AI model itself to generate something. Up here in this slide is an example of Brightspace generating assignment ideas with a magical button, the do my job for me button, that it always shows us anytime we try to create an assignment. So I enter in the content from a single module of an online course that I'm teaching this summer, and I get three very vague, very basic, very uninformed assignment ideas, most of which I've already rejected. And without going into the nuts and bolts of the journalism and broadcasting writing courses that I'm teaching, if I were to use any of these bases for assignments, I would be steering my students in the wrong direction. I would be teaching them the wrong way to approach writing. I would be teaching them the wrong style of writing. In this case, the story or the module that we were doing was about writing news for radio. And one of the assignment ideas is imagine you are producing a short video segment. Well, we're not supposed to be doing video, and that's a completely different type of writing style that we don't get into until module 5 of the course. But the AI doesn't know that. It hasn't taught my course. It doesn't understand the style and expertise I'm bringing. It just knows the facts. So a better way of approaching this is to stress test an existing idea. And this was something that I did that I thought really strengthened a course I did this past semester in the spring, which was sports reporting and writing. This was a course that SUNY Oswego hadn't offered in about 5 years. And so I had very limited information on what had been done successfully in those prior years. And I could try my best to come up with good assignment ideas. And having had a sports media background, that came to me fairly naturally. But what I realized was it's not necessarily that easy to phrase these assignments and these tasks in a way that students are going to understand, especially because I'm significantly older than they are too. So I asked, in this case, which model did I use for this? I used Claude for this one. I asked it to read through the assignment outline, pretend, it's always good when you give AI a role. So I said, pretend that you're an upper division journalism student and tell me what is still confusing about this assignment outline. Recommend to me some changes, but don't implement them. Because if you don't tell it not to implement something, it's going to do the work for you and try to mess up your stuff. And then again, more work is being done to refine their outputs. It came back with 10 very specific issues, most of which I agreed with, several that I hadn't seen, including contradictory instructions I'd given students about word count, a process that I thought I had explained pretty well about submitting a draft to me through Google Docs, but the AI pointed out it's not quite clear who has to submit it, how many have to be submitted, what the feedback timeline is, etc. And I had a reaction that at first was negative to say, well, I can't handhold you, Claude, through every element of this assignment. You've got to figure some things out yourself. But it phrased it to me in a very good way, not to say that I was in the wrong for not being exceptionally detailed in my instruction, but it phrased it as a time saver for me by saying, if you clarify this part of your assignment overview, you'll have way fewer emails clogging up your inbox on a Friday night because nobody knows what they're actually supposed to do. So my reaction to the AI's feedback was actually very similar to the reaction I would often have to a student's feedback, where they would say, I don't understand this, I'm not quite clear on this. And I would think, well, how could you not be clear? I thought I explained it as clearly as humanly possible. But again, we all communicate differently. So this gave me that opportunity ahead of time to make some of those changes. There were other things with my rubric that it mentioned right away. I had set a minimum for visual content in the reporting assignment that was exceptionally vague and basically didn't make it clear to them whether this needed to be a visual story or whether they just needed one photo. And what was really nice about it is it ranked the issues as well, from the most dangerous or highest risk down to the lowest risk. I still stayed the author through this entire process, but it was my tireless first reader that could give me those pieces of feedback right away. I found that exceptionally useful. And then I kind of used the same concept when it came to rubrics. So for putting together the way of evaluating these kinds of assignments, I found it so tedious back in the fall semester to create the entire grid itself and be specific enough that students were going to understand what I was asking for. And I realized I could just write one column. I could give it basically how many levels of performance I wanted to allow for, how many different criteria I had, and what I wanted them to be weighed. Because again, I have the experience of asking it to make a rubric from scratch. If I say, read this assignment, make me a rubric, it ends up putting together and prioritizing things that I wouldn't prioritize, because that's not always clear from the rubric. It thinks everything should be equal. But no, AP style, I may talk about Associated Press style a lot in journalism assignments, but I don't need that to be worth 30% of the grade because it's just essentially syntax and grammar. So I just wrote the exceptional level. I said, okay, what's a perfect submission look like to me? And this slide here is a little shorter than what I actually wrote. I just trimmed it down for the sake of the presentation. My descriptions were closer to a paragraph. But just by inserting that, how important are each of these? How many categories do I need? And what does exceptional look like? It was then able to split out or to feed back to me the entire grid of the remainder of the rubric in a way that actually worked pretty well. It did a very good job of staging the gradations of the rubric. It goes from distinctive voice to lacks a unique voice, comes down to generic or cliche. These were all things that, yes, are exactly what I need students to avoid, but it was able to surmise that just from my description of what an excellent example was. Steve?
Is that what AI gave back to you, or is that
Yes.
what you gave to AI?
No, this is what it gave back to me. So I just added this on to the right side of the piece that I had in that prior slide. So all I did was this part here.
Oh, okay.
I said, here's categories, here's what's important, here's what good looks like, and then it gives me all of that. So that's, I think, 16, 18 cells that it generated for me when I only had to create 6. And again, it wasn't perfect right away. There were some things I looked into and I said, okay, that's not quite what I mean when it comes to this category. And I still had to refine it, but it was still an enormous time saver. And it made it much easier to have something I could build on for future assignments moving forward. So that's my thoughts on rubrics. One other piece here is quizzes. I started out back in the fall semester thinking, again, I could just click generate questions and it's going to give me great exam questions and answers. Brightspace isn't great at this. There's a limit of 10 questions that you can generate. And then if you want to generate again, you can do that, but it might end up generating the same questions because it doesn't have a memory of what it's already given to you. What I found is a good strategy is to give it the question and the answer and ask it to focus on creating wrong answers, especially when it comes to multiple choice. One reason I switched to this is there's an example up here from ChatGPT, which I was using back in the fall semester and I don't use anymore. In a course I was teaching for business students, actually, COM 211, where we have an OER textbook, so everything's just available. And I thought it would be fairly easy to use an AI tool to generate some good questions for someone who doesn't have that educational background. But it came up with this one here, which I think is really indicative of one of its major flaws, which is not understanding what makes a plausible answer. So the question was, which tactic most credibly supports a persuasive claim? Option B is really obviously correct because it's the longest one and it's the only one without negative connotations built into the answer. So it's right from the beginning. You might not have read a single page of the textbook and you would know the answer is B, specific, verifiable, mirrors the audience's situation. There's all these positive things in it. And then the distractors that ChatGPT thinks my students are dumb enough to pick, which whatever I might say about my students, I would never go that far. Anonymous testimonials without context, all these negative terms in them, superlatives with no data, technical specs with no link to outcomes. It's really obvious that the negative answers are the ones that are incorrect. So this was my first wake-up call to, okay, it's not the magic bullet. You've got to go beyond a single mouse click to actually get use out of this. But here's the good thing. Once I caught that, and all I did in my response to ChatGPT here was I didn't even tell it why that question was flawed. I said, because I'd asked it in generating the quizzes, make sure the distractor answers are plausible. So when I got as terrible a question as that one was, all I said was, do you realize why that question is terrible? That's all I wrote. And it was able to pop in this note that's right above my head here that responded in the canvas, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, where it realized right away what the problem with the question was. But this is the important thing. It did nail the diagnosis. It then suggested some actually pretty reasonable replacements, and eventually we got there. And that showed me that it can refine things to a high standard, but it won't do that on its own. I have to drive that review. And that's why you have to think of yourself very much as the editor, even though the large language models themselves want to just give you a huge piece of output and have you just take that and use it. This all happened right inside the canvas, which is the next technique that I think is really, really key to being able to be efficient with generating things using an AI tool. So Claude calls these artifacts, ChatGPT and Gemini call it a canvas. When you iterate something with an LLM, don't make it regenerate the whole document every single time. The output should live in a side panel and edits should happen in place. which reduces the amount of usage that you're using up. And usage limits are a major, major issue that I'm starting to run in, especially the more complicated some of my outputs start to become. So in my case here, this is actually on the right side from Gemini. This was during that Google presentation that we did at Lanigan a little while back, where they were asking us to try things out. And I said, all right, I'm going to create a fictitious course proposal. It kept spitting out a full course proposal to me in the chat every time I asked for a little change in a single sentence. So again, it won't do this on its own. I had to go and say to it, create the course proposal document as a canvas that we can collaborate on. Then it finally did. The little blue box there in the top right pops up. And when I click that, now a sidebar shows up. And I can say, change the course prefix, change this part of the course description. And instead of regenerating an entire document every single time, it's just going to hone in on those pieces that I needed it to change those, and thus your usage limits still are a little bit less overstressed. The challenge, though, is these usage limits still exist. And thank you, Emily. I appreciate it. I'm glad it's useful. This has been a game changer for me, especially in putting together more complex documents, putting together exams and quizzes, especially if it's a combination of my own work and AI contributions. Much, much easier to keep things organized. However, here's still the challenge. Is when it comes to Gemini, I was doing this in Lanigan. I got 4 prompts into this course proposal project that we were putting together before it said, oh, your usage is done. You've used it all up. And this is a challenge that we have. There was the suggestion at that Google seminar, and I think a lot of us have had to do it. Oh, just switch to your personal account and use that so you get double the allotment. Well, okay, that's great, but now I'm uploading data that is now usable by that LLM. It doesn't have the same data protections that we have for SUNY Oswego. So if there's anybody that has the authority to bump up our account status for Gemini, I would strongly suggest that, because I find a lot of us end up moving to our own paid versions, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, Anthropic, or Gemini, in order to get those capabilities that we really want. And one of the things that's really great, and this is Notebook LM as an example here, is it gives visual flair to content I've already created. This is an example of a slide generated as part of a Notebook LM slide deck for my sports journalism class. We did a day on sports photography. And my crappy, poorly visually put together presentation would have just been an example of a sports photo and then some black text on a white background, or maybe green on gold if I'm feeling very fancy, explaining the different concepts that I want students to see in that photo. Well, when I uploaded that to Notebook LM and gave it the simple instruction of make this look cooler, it not only rearranged things to make them look a little bit nicer, added a little green text for some of those subheadings, but it was able to recognize what parts of the image related to the elements that I was telling the students. I didn't have to tell it, okay, aperture control, you should have an arrow pointing to the blurred out crowd because that's what that demonstrates. No, it actually just knew that on its own. That doesn't happen 100% of the time. And this is one of the challenges, especially when it comes to your usage limits, is that I can only generate, I think it's 12 slides in a single presentation and 3 presentations a day with Notebook LM right now. And I'm sure those will change. I'm sure they'll get better. Finally, we can export those as PowerPoints and do some editing. But it's not something where I can say, if they made a typo here, if aperture was spelled wrong, I couldn't go and tell Notebook LM, you spelled aperture wrong, just change that piece of text. No, it has to regenerate the entire slide deck now. And I can only get 3 of those a day. So you can run up against those usage limits very, very quickly. And that's why a complicated prompt, I literally put in my prompts for all of these sorts of things. Double check your spelling, double check your text. Sometimes it melds words together, puts a graphic on top of a word. You have to ask it to review when it comes to stuff like this, because unlike things in a canvas, it can't just go in and change those last few things. Speed through the last things really quickly. The last thing here is importing quizzes into Brightspace. If you haven't done this before, this has saved me an enormous amount of time. Anytime you're in the question library or a quiz in Brightspace and you click on upload a file, you'll see a link down there that says download template CSV. So it downloads a comma separated file. If you open that in Notepad, you'll see it has examples for each type of question that might go into Brightspace. But if I was going to create a quiz document in this format, it would take me way longer than just doing it in Brightspace itself, even though I hate doing that because you have to create every question individually. There's no way to do it in a mass format. This is where the canvas comes in, though. Here's an example in Claude where we had been working on a quiz together, and I'd been giving it my questions and the correct answers, and I said, generate the wrong answers for me. It did a pretty good job of that, and then I uploaded that template CSV from Brightspace. I didn't make any changes to it. I uploaded that template, and I said, here's what it should look like for import. Take the questions that we've created, put it into that format, and it did it. And that's what this is here. It's the CSV shown as a spreadsheet in Claude as an artifact. This would work in a canvas in Gemini or ChatGPT as well. And then I downloaded it, uploaded it to Brightspace, and boom, all the questions went in perfectly. So now I don't have to go into Brightspace and create question 1, create question 2, create question 3. I can do it this way, and it's also very useful for shuffling correct answers so that you can have a nice, not too much repetition as to what the correct answers are. So strongly suggest people look at doing that. It requires very little work. Just drag that template file in and tell the AI model, make it based on this file, and it will generally be able to do that for you. Guardrails, of course, review everything, protect your data, verify the specifics. The text in bold are the things that I would say should be takeaways for everybody. Assume the first attempt is flawed and remind your AI to avoid its most common pitfalls because it will make them if you're not there to get in the way. But if there's 5 main points to come out of this, use these tools to stress test as opposed to authoring things, and you'll feel a lot more comfortable. Use it to anchor your rubric and then fill in the blanks, not to do it all itself. Seed your distractors, give it right answers and ask it to come up with wrong ones. I do this with writing exercises as well. AI is terrible at broadcast writing, but it is very good at bad broadcast writing. So when I want to make an assignment for my students to correct common mistakes, it's very good at generating examples of common mistakes. It's very good at doing a bad job. And that can be just as useful sometimes as it being good at doing a good job. Edit things in place where you can. Artifacts and canvases have absolutely saved hours and hours of my time. And when in doubt, hand over those complicated files, let it create a sample to match that, and it makes life a lot easier as well. I went way over time, John, which I apologize for, but appreciate everybody giving me the opportunity and happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Yeah, going back to something you said earlier, you were giving an assignment and then you were telling the AI, I think it was to respond to it or whatever, as if it was an upper division student.
Yes.
How do you program the AI to distinguish between say freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, or whatever?
Yeah, it kind of knows. It operates out of the assumption. And I've done it that way as well, where I've said, this is a class of freshmen who barely know anything about how to write academically in the first place. Thus, naturally, it raises the standard, it lowers the standard as to where it's going to pop in and say, this could be confusing. The idea here is if I didn't tell them, and I didn't just say they were upper division students, I also said they were upper division journalism students who have taken reporting classes. So the only reason I do that is to sort of eliminate things where I know it's not going to be a valid concern. So if I say to it, evaluate this like somebody who just came in out of the street and read my assignment instruction, it's going to say, well, you didn't define what AP style means. Well, okay, but an upper division journalism student, it kind of naturally knows that those kinds of terms would be known. But there is a risk there because, again, I only have this in the context of journalism and broadcasting where it does seem to have an idea of what is advanced versus basic knowledge. Other forms of knowledge, it might not be as well attuned in that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's been trained on a tremendous amount of material from
Yeah.
other syllabi courses, all sorts of material it's stolen. So it has a lot of information in there that it can use to fine tune it for the audience that you're addressing.
Yeah. The more accessible your field of study is generally, the better it knows things. The more things are behind paywalls and the like, the less it has to go off of.
Although it's got a lot of those materials.
I know it does. I like to pretend it doesn't.
Any questions? Okay, we'll stop the recording. Thank you.
Beautiful.
And thank you, Steve.
This may not be a big deal.